Hey there, dreamers. Welcome back to our channel. Before we drift into the classic journey of Isabella Garcia Shapiro from Phineas and Ferb, I would love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see how far and wide our sleepy little community reaches. All right, lights low, blankets up. Let's begin. The sun was beginning its slow descent over Danville, painting the neighborhood in soft strokes of pink, gold, and lavender. The air carried the warmth of the day, now mellowed into a gentle, lingering heat that felt like a hug from summer itself. Shadows stretched across sidewalks, lengthening with each passing minute, and the hum of cicadas began to rise, steady, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. Isabella Garcia Shapiro walked along the quiet street, her small Fireside Girls satchel hanging from her shoulder. The fabric still smelled faintly of the wildflowers she and her troop had gathered earlier that afternoon. Her hands were smudged with a little bit of dirt, a badge of honor from helping Mrs. Fitzpatrick, an elderly neighbor, tend to her garden. They had watered geraniums, pulled a few stubborn weeds, and even replanted a tiny sapling that was leaning too far toward the fence. Mrs. Fitzpatrick had thanked her with a gentle pat on the shoulder and a tin of oatmeal cookies wrapped in wax paper. Now, tucked safely in her bag, those cookies gave off a sweet, toasty scent that seemed to follow Isabella with every step. She walked slowly, not because she was tired, but because there was no reason to rush. The neighborhood was calm. Houses glowed softly from within, curtains swaying with the breeze from open windows. Somewhere in the distance, a sprinkler tick-tick-ticked across a front lawn, the droplets catching the last light like tiny prisma. A cat darted across the street and paused to watch her with curious golden eyes before slipping between a pair of hedges. Above her, the sky deepened into a velvety purple at the edges, with streaks of fading orange still holding on in the west. A few brave stars had begun to show themselves, faint pinpricks against the endless canvas. Isabella took a deep breath, feeling that peaceful weightlessness that only came when the day had worked hard but now had permission to rest. She thought briefly of Phineas and Ferb, wondering what they might be up to right now. Probably finishing another one of their big summer inventions. Maybe this one would be something extraordinary, like a backyard roller rink or a sunset watching tower. She smiled to herself at the thought. Whatever it was, it would be ready tomorrow, and she'd be right there to see it. But tonight, the adventures could wait. Tonight was a soft evening for slow walks and simple thoughts. As she passed by the corner store, the owner, Mr. Jenkins, was sweeping the sidewalk. He lifted a hand in greeting, and Isabella waved back, her steps still steady and unhurried. The bell over the shop door jingled as a customer left, the sound fading quickly into the quiet hum of the neighborhood. She turned down her street, the familiar sight of her house appearing at the far end. Its porch light glowed like a little beacon, warm and inviting. Across the road stood the Flynn Fletcher house, its backyard just barely visible over the fence. She thought she could hear muffled laughter from that direction, though it might have been her imagination. In the gathering twilight, Isabella's world felt small in the best way, safe, warm, and threaded with the kind of calm that made the day's busyness feel far away. She shifted her satchel slightly, feeling the weight of the cookies and the comforting pull of home just a few houses away. The breeze picked up again, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass and the faint perfume of lilacs. It brushed against her cheeks, cool and soft. The cicada's song continued, weaving together with the distant bark of a dog and the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. Isabella slowed even more, letting her eyes wander to the houses on either side. She knew each one by heart, the one with the sunflower pots lining the porch, the one with wind chimes that sang when the air moved, the one whose fence was always painted a bright, cheerful blue. Every detail felt familiar, like pages in a story she had read countless times but still loved to revisit. And though she knew she'd be home in just a few minutes, she didn't mind the walk lasting a little longer. After all, summer evenings like this didn't need to be hurried. They were meant to be lived slowly, step by step, moment by moment, until the day gave way to the night. Isabella's footsteps made a soft, rhythmic sound against the sidewalk, a gentle tap-tap that blended into the evening's quiet melody. The light from the street lamps had just begun to flicker on one by one, casting warm circles on the pavement. Each pool of light felt like its own little safe haven, glowing in the gathering dusk. She glanced upward, catching sight of a plane passing high above. Its tiny, blinking light traced a slow, steady path across the sky, and she wondered briefly where it was going. Was it carrying families on their way to vacation? Friends coming home after a long trip? She liked imagining little stories for the people on board. It made the world feel bigger, yet still connected in some invisible way. The breeze shifted, carrying the distant scent of something sweet, maybe pie cooling on a windowsill somewhere, or the faint aroma from the bakery 2 blocks over. It mixed pleasantly with the smell of the oatmeal cookies in her bag. The thought made her smile. She knew she'd probably share them later with her mom and Pinky, maybe with a cup of tea or warm milk. Passing by the park, Isabella paused for a moment at the gate. The swings swayed lazily in the breeze, creaking just a little on their chains. The playground was empty now, though earlier in the day it had been full of kids chasing each other and playing tag. In the dimming light, the park felt different, calmer, almost magical. Fireflies had begun to appear along the edge of the grass, their tiny lights blinking in a slow, unhurried rhythm, as if they too were readying themselves for the night. She took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs, then continued walking. The sound of her shoes on the concrete was now accompanied by the faint chirping of crickets. The noises of the day, car engines, distant conversations, the occasional bark of a dog were fading, replaced by softer, more measured sounds. As she approached the last stretch before her house, Isabella passed the mailbox that had been there for as long as she could remember. Its paint was chipped in a way that seemed permanent now, like it belonged to the character of the neighborhood. The fence beside it was covered in vines, their leaves brushing softly against one another in the wind. She could see the glow of her house more clearly now, the porch light casting a welcoming circle onto the front steps. The thought of stepping inside, kicking off her shoes, and feeling the cool wooden floor under her feet made her chest feel warm and content. Across the street, the Flynn Fletcher backyard looked quiet. There was no sign of the day's project, but Isabella knew from experience that tomorrow morning something amazing would appear there. It always did. For now, though, it was just as peaceful as the rest of the neighborhood, the only movement coming from a curtain shifting in the breeze. The sky overhead had deepened into a rich, dusky blue, with more stars emerging by the minute. The first hints of moonlight brushed across the rooftops, soft and silver. Isabella slowed her pace again, wanting to take in this moment. The mix of fading sunlight, rising moonlight, and the gentle hum of life settling down for the night. She thought about the rest of her evening. There was no homework tonight, no meetings for the Fireside Girls, no chores waiting for her beyond the simple comforts of home. It was one of those rare, perfect evenings where the only plan was to simply exist in it, to let time flow as gently as the breeze moving through the leaves above. She adjusted the strap of her satchel again, feeling the familiar weight of the cookies and her little notebook tucked inside. That notebook was where she kept small sketches, badge ideas, and bits of poetry she'd write whenever inspiration struck. Maybe tonight, before bed, she'd jot something down about this walk. The way the air smelled, the way the sky looked, the way it felt to know tomorrow held adventures, but tonight belonged to peace. Her front yard was just a few steps away now, and the grass gently swaying in the cool air. The fireflies had followed her here, their light dotting the shadows like tiny lanterns. Isabella stepped off the sidewalk and onto the familiar little stone path that wound through her front yard. Each stone was warm from the day's sun, and even though the air had cooled, the heat lingered just enough to be comforting under her shoes. The garden along the edge of the path was alive with soft rustles, tiny night creatures going about their quiet business, and the faint, sweet scent of blooming jasmine drifted toward her. She slowed to admire the flowers her mother had planted earlier that summer. The marigolds were still bright, even in the fading light, their petals glowing faintly against the deep green leaves. A small moth fluttered past her face, its delicate wings catching the sliver of moonlight. Isabella watched it disappear into the shadows before continuing toward the porch. The wooden boards creaked gently under her weight as she stepped onto the first stair. That sound, the familiar groan of old wood, was like the house's way of saying hello. The porch light above her buzzed faintly, casting its warm glow in a perfect circle that made the surrounding darkness feel friendly rather than distant. She turned for a moment before going inside, resting her elbows on the porch railing. From here she could see the street in both directions. A lone cyclist pedaled slowly past, the little light on the front of the bike blinking with each turn of the wheel. A few houses away, someone's wind chimes began to sing softly as the breeze picked up again, their gentle notes mingling with the steady background chorus of crickets. It was one of those evenings where every sound seemed measured, unrushed, the kind where even the air seemed to move more slowly, like it knew there was no reason to hurry the night along. Isabella leaned against the railing for a moment longer, letting her eyes wander upward. The stars were clearer now, scattered across the sky in shimmering constellations she only half remembered from Fireside Girls' astronomy nights. She spotted the moon, now high enough to light the rooftops in pale silver, and for a moment she imagined it as a silent guardian, watching over all of Danville. Behind her, a faint thump came from inside the house, Pinky most likely, hopping down from the couch to investigate her return. The thought made her smile. She could already picture him sitting by the door, tail wagging, ready to greet her with all the enthusiasm in the world. She shifted her satchel off her shoulder and placed it on the porch swing for a moment. The swing swayed gently under the weight, creaking in that soft, rhythmic way that made it sound like it was sighing contentedly. Isabella brushed her hand along the wooden armrest, feeling the smoothness worn in by years of warm summer nights and cool autumn evenings. The smell of her mom's cooking drifted faintly through the open front window, something savory with hints of rosemary and garlic. It was the kind of scent that could make you feel full even before you'd taken a bite. She stood there a little longer, letting the evening wrap around her like a blanket. The moonlight on the rooftops, the warm glow from the windows, the sound of leaves brushing together. It was all part of the same quiet, gentle world that seemed to exist just for these few hours between day and night. At last, she reached for her satchel, slinging it over her shoulder again. With one last glance at the peaceful street, she turned toward the door. Her hand rested for a moment on the cool metal of the doorknob, as if savoring the simple act of coming home. Then, with the softest creak of hinges, she stepped inside. The moment Isabella stepped inside, the air shifted around her, cooler than outside, carrying the comforting scent of home. The warm glow from the living room lamps softened the corners of the room, casting golden light over the familiar patterns on the carpet and the gentle curve of the couch cushions. Pinky was the first to greet her, trotting over with a wagging tail that seemed almost too big for his little body. His nails made a quick, light tap-tap on the wooden floor as he bounded toward her. "Hey, Pinky," Isabella murmured with a smile, bending down to scratch behind his ears. His fur was soft and warm, and he gave a happy little snuffle before pressing his nose briefly into her palm. From her satchel, she pulled out a small crumb from the oatmeal cookies, which he accepted with a quiet enthusiasm before curling back into his favorite spot on the couch. From the kitchen came the muffled sound of her mom moving about, cutlery clinking, the soft thud of a cupboard closing. The smell of something savory and rich drifted in, blending perfectly with the faint sweetness of the cookies still in her bag. "You're just in time, sweetheart," her mom called gently. "Dinner's almost ready." Isabella slipped off her shoes by the door and set her satchel down on the entry table. She felt the day's warmth lingering on her skin, mixing pleasantly with the cool air inside. Slowly she made her way toward the kitchen, each step carrying her deeper into the gentle rhythm of home. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the quiet bubbling of something on the stove, and the rhythmic clink of a spoon against a pot all wove together into the background, a domestic lullaby that made the outside world feel far away. Pinky's breathing was a slow, steady sound from the couch, and through the window, the last bit of daylight had almost completely given way to night. The street lamps outside cast a faint glow through the curtains, but in here the light was warmer, closer. Isabella leaned against the doorway to the kitchen, watching her mom stir something fragrant and delicious, feeling the weight of the evening settle gently around her like a favorite blanket. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. Tonight was going to be quiet, peaceful, exactly as she liked it. Isabella stepped fully into the kitchen, her bare feet meeting the cool tiles with a faint, satisfying touch. The shift from the gentle evening breeze outside to the comforting warmth of her home made her shoulders relax instantly, as if her whole body recognized it was in a safe place. Her mom stood at the stove, wooden spoon in hand, gently stirring a pot of something that sent up curls of fragrant steam. The scent was layered. First the earthy sweetness of carrots, then the soft sharpness of rosemary, and somewhere underneath it all, the deep, savory aroma of slow-cooked broth. The air was thick with it in the best possible way, like a warm hug in the form of a smell. "Long day?" her mom asked, not looking up from the pot, but smiling just the same. "Good day," Isabella replied softly, setting her satchel down on one of the dining chairs. "We helped Mrs. Fitzpatrick in her garden. She gave me some cookies." Her mom's eyes flickered to the bag with a knowing glint. "The oatmeal ones?" "The oatmeal ones," Isabella confirmed, smiling. They didn't say anything more for a moment. The kitchen didn't need words right now. It already spoke in the quiet bubbling of the pot, the faint metallic clink as her mom set the spoon down, and the steady hum of the refrigerator in the background. Pinky wandered in, clearly hoping for another crumb. He sat at Isabella's feet, tilting his head slightly in the way only dogs can, as if to say, "I'm being very polite, so surely you'll give me more snacks." Isabella crouched to give him a quick pat, his tail thumping against the tile with quiet determination. "Why don't you set the table?" her mom suggested gently. Isabella nodded, stepping over to the cupboard where the plates were stacked in neat piles. She chose 2 dinner plates and set them on the wooden table, followed by silverware that made a soft clink with each placement. The motion was almost meditative. Plate, fork, knife, spoon, repeated twice. She placed folded cloth napkins beside each setting, their faint lavender scent telling her they'd been freshly laundered. A pitcher of water sat in the fridge, condensation beading on its sides. She poured 2 glasses, watching the way the water rippled and caught the light. The glasses made a quiet, satisfying clink as she set them on the table. From the stove came the faint sound of a gentle simmer, the occasional bubble breaking the surface. Her mom ladled the stew into bowls, the steam curling upward and momentarily fogging her glasses. Isabella caught the sight of the tender vegetables floating in the rich broth, the way the colors of the carrots and green beans seemed to glow in the lamplight. They sat together, the chairs giving a faint creak as they settled in. The first spoonful was always the best, hot, flavorful, grounding. Isabella felt the warmth spread from her mouth down to her chest, her whole body relaxing with each slow bite. Outside, night had settled fully. Through the kitchen window, she could see the reflection of the room against the dark glass, overlaid with faint pinpricks of starlight. The street beyond was quiet now, with only the occasional flicker of a passing firefly. The conversation was soft and slow, bits and pieces about the day, the gentle kind of talking where there's no rush to get anywhere. Between words came comfortable pauses filled with the sound of spoons dipping and bowls being set down gently on the table. When the bowls were empty, her mom gathered the dishes, the quiet swish of running water filling the air as she rinsed them in the sink. Isabella dried them carefully, stacking each plate with a neat, muted thunk against the others. When the kitchen was clean again, she felt that warm, pleasant tiredness that came from both a full stomach and the sense that the day's work, no matter how small, was done. She turned toward the living room, where the lamp on the side table cast a circle of golden light onto the couch. Pinky had already claimed his favorite cushion, eyes half closed, ears twitching every now and then at distant night sounds. The living room seemed to welcome her in without a sound, its warmth wrapping around her like an old familiar quilt. The light from the single lamp on the side table was just enough to give the space a golden glow, leaving the corners in a cozy half shadow. The faint scent of the stew lingered in the air, blending with the soft lavender that drifted from the vase of flowers on the coffee table. Isabella moved toward the couch, her footsteps cushioned by the thick, worn rug beneath her. She sank into the corner cushion, feeling the fabric give under her weight in that way that only comes from a well-loved seat. Pinky lifted his head for a moment, blinked at her slowly as if to say, "You're here now, good," and then rested his head back down. For a moment, Isabella simply sat there, letting the quiet fill her ears. The clock on the wall ticked with a steady, patient rhythm. Somewhere deep in the house, the old pipes let out a soft creak, followed by the gentle hum of the heater switching on. It was the kind of background noise that didn't intrude. It became part of the room itself, part of the comfort. On the small side table beside her sat a stack of magazines, a book she'd been halfway through for weeks, and a ceramic mug with a faint ring at the bottom from earlier in the day. She picked up the book, running her fingers along the slightly worn edges of the cover. The pages smelled faintly of paper and time, an oddly soothing scent that made her think of libraries and rainy afternoons. She opened it and let her eyes fall into the printed words, not because she was desperate to find out what happened next, but because reading was like stepping into a second layer of quiet. Her mind eased into the rhythm of sentences, and every now and then she'd glance up at the window beside her. The curtains were drawn halfway, giving her a slice of the outside world, just enough to see a faint star blinking in the deep indigo sky. Her mom's footsteps moved softly from the kitchen toward the hallway, and soon the sound of running water came from the bathroom down the hall. The gentle hiss of the faucet, the muted splash of water against porcelain, it all blended into the calm backdrop of the house settling into night. Isabella's reading slowed until she wasn't really following the words anymore. Instead, her gaze drifted to the coffee table, where her satchel rested from earlier. She reached over and unbuckled it, pulling out the small tin of oatmeal cookies Mrs. Fitzpatrick had given her. The lid came off with a quiet pop, and the sweet, toasty aroma escaped instantly, wrapping her senses in a wave of familiarity. She broke one in half, the crumbly texture giving way with just enough resistance, and took a small bite. The cookie was still faintly soft from being freshly baked earlier that day, the oats chewy, and the cinnamon subtle but warm. Pinky's head popped up again, his nose twitching, and Isabella smiled, breaking off a tiny piece for him. He took it gently and settled right back down, the soft sound of his chewing fading almost immediately into a content sigh. The room was quiet, except for the occasional faint creak of the house and the distant tick of the clock. Isabella set the cookie tin on the table and leaned back into the couch, the cushions molding comfortably to her. She pulled the throw blanket from the armrest, draping it over her legs. The fabric was soft and carried the faint scent of laundry detergent from its last wash, a comforting, clean smell that made her want to sink deeper into it. Her eyelids grew a little heavier, but she didn't want to close them just yet. Nights like this, she thought, were worth staying awake for, just to feel the softness of the air, to hear the slow rhythm of a home at peace, to know that tomorrow was waiting, but tonight had no demand at all. The blanket's warmth and the couch's gentle embrace made Isabella feel almost too comfortable to move, but after a few minutes she decided a warm drink would be the perfect addition to her evening. Slowly she slid the blanket aside and padded back into the kitchen, her steps muffled by the rug underfoot, and then clicking faintly against the cool tile. The kitchen felt a little dimmer now, lit only by the soft glow from the stove's overhead light, and the golden spill from the living room lamp behind her. She reached for her favorite mug, a pale pink one, with a small chip near the handle, and set it on the counter. From the cupboard, she took down a small tin of cocoa mix, the faint scent of chocolate escaping as she unscrewed the lid. She spooned some into the mug, then filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove. The soft, metallic click of the switch was followed by a low hum as the kettle began to heat. While she waited, Isabella leaned against the counter, letting her eyes drift toward the window above the sink. The outside world beyond the glass was dark now, the only light coming from the street lamp across the road. In the faint glow, she could just make out the outline of the Flynn Fletcher house. Its windows were dark, save for one upstairs that still had a faint light shining. The kettle began to rumble, the sound growing from a gentle murmur to a more insistent bubbling. Steam curled upward in delicate wisps, fogging the air for a moment before disappearing. Isabella poured the hot water into her mug, stirring slowly until the cocoa dissolved into a rich, smooth swirl of brown. She added a splash of milk from the fridge, watching it spiral and blend into the drink until it was the perfect shade. Carrying the mug carefully, she returned to the living room. The blanket was waiting for her, still warm from before, and she settled back into her spot on the couch. The first sip of cocoa was just hot enough to make her pause, holding it in her mouth before swallowing. It spread a gentle warmth through her chest, the sweetness pairing perfectly with the lingering taste of oatmeal from the cookie she'd eaten earlier. Pinky had shifted in his sleep, now curled up with his nose tucked under his tail. Every so often, one of his paws twitched slightly as if he were chasing something in a dream. Isabella reached over and stroked his back softly, careful not to wake him. His breathing was slow and steady, matching the quiet rhythm of the house around them. She set her mug down for a moment and pulled her notebook from her satchel. The cover was worn at the edges, and the pages inside held a mix of doodles, badge designs, and little scraps of thoughts she'd written down in moments like this. She flipped to a blank page and began to write. Not about anything big or important, just small observations. The street lamp outside looks like it's holding up the moon. Pinky dreams with his paws. The cocoa smells like winter even though it's summer. The night is not empty, it's full of small, soft sounds. The act of writing made her feel even calmer, like she was gathering the evening into her notebook to keep it forever. She paused every now and then to take another sip of cocoa, her eyes drifting to the window where the curtains framed that slice of night sky. The stars seemed brighter now. She counted a few without meaning to, her gaze following their gentle shimmer, until her thoughts began to slow again. She closed the notebook, tucking it beside her on the couch, and curled deeper under the blanket. The warmth from the cocoa, the gentle weight of the blanket, and the soft tick of the clock were beginning to work together in a lullaby only her home could make. The cocoa mug was now only half full, its steam curling faintly in the dim lamplight. Isabella swirled it gently, watching the liquid move in slow circles. The warmth radiating from it made her fingers feel almost drowsy in their grip. She took another sip, letting the sweetness linger as her gaze wandered around the room. The shadows had grown longer, stretching lazily across the walls and floor. The faint golden pool from the lamp seemed to hold back the darkness, making the living room feel like a little island in the middle of a vast, sleeping sea. From the kitchen, a soft sound, just the faint clink of her mom placing a plate in the sink, echoed through the house. Isabella smiled faintly. It wasn't loud enough to disturb the peace, just a gentle reminder that she wasn't alone in this quiet night. Pinky stirred, stretching his front paws out before curling right back into himself, his ears twitching once as if he were listening to a dream. Isabella reached over and tugged the blanket a little higher over her shoulders, feeling the cozy cocoon wrap more snugly around her. Her eyes began to drift closed, but she shook her head slightly, not ready to fall asleep here. She wanted the quiet ritual of getting ready for bed, brushing her teeth, pulling on her softest pajamas, and tucking herself in beneath her own covers. It was a process she secretly loved, almost as much as the day's adventures. With a slow sigh, she set the cocoa on the coffee table, promising herself she'd finish it before bed. She stood, her toes curling slightly against the rug as she stretched her arms overhead. The blanket slid from her shoulders and puddled gently on the couch, waiting for tomorrow. She picked up her notebook and tucked it under her arm, then gathered the mug and brought it back into the kitchen. The warm light above the stove cast a golden glow over the counter as she set the mug down. Her mom peeked around the corner, smiling softly. "Heading to bed soon?" "Yeah," Isabella replied quietly. "Just winding down." The hall leading to her room felt darker, but not in a way that was unsettling. The shadows there were softer, gentler, familiar friends she'd walked past countless times. The creak of the third floorboard from the living room made her smile. It was the same sound it had always made, part of the house's nightly symphony. When she stepped into her bedroom, the familiar scent of lavender and paper greeted her. The curtains were drawn, but a sliver of moonlight still peeked in at the edges, casting a pale stripe across her bed. Her quilt was slightly rumpled, as if it had been waiting for her return all evening. She set her notebook on the nightstand, then opened her dresser to pull out a pair of soft cotton pajamas. They were her favorite ones, patterned with tiny pink flowers. The fabric worn in and impossibly comfortable from years of washes. In the quiet, she could hear the faint hum of the fridge from the kitchen and the occasional distant bark of a dog somewhere in the neighborhood. The night felt alive in its own slow way. She changed into her pajamas and took a moment to brush her hair at the small vanity in the corner of her room. Each stroke of the brush made her eyes grow heavier, her body more relaxed. Pinky had padded in at some point, now sitting patiently by her bed, tail wagging just once as their eyes met. Isabella laughed softly. All right. You can sleep in here tonight." The little dog hopped up onto the bed with ease, circling twice before settling into a warm little ball near the foot. Isabella slid under the quilt, pulling it up to her chin. The sheets were cool at first touch, but they quickly began to warm with her presence. She lay there for a moment, listening to Pinky's slow breathing and the whisper of the night outside. It was the kind of stillness that felt safe, wrapping her in a quiet promise that tomorrow would be another good day. Her eyes began to drift shut, and the silver stripe of moonlight shifted slightly across the quilt as a faint breeze stirred the curtains. The world outside was resting, and so was she. The first thing Isabella noticed when she stirred was the softness of the morning light peeking faintly through her curtains. It wasn't bright, not the kind of morning that rushed in with bold sunlight, but rather a quiet, silver-tinted glow, the sort of light that made the world seem to speak in hushed tones. The air in her room was cool and still, and she could hear the faint hum of life beginning outside. Pinky was still curled near the foot of the bed, his breathing deep and rhythmic. She smiled, taking a slow moment to simply exist there, lying still under the covers, letting the gentle start of the day seep in. She could hear the soft rustle of leaves beyond her window, a sound she loved in the early hours. It always reminded her that the world outside was alive, even when she wasn't looking. Somewhere far off, a bird trilled, a single, thoughtful note that hung in the air for a moment before being answered by another. Isabella finally pushed the quilt aside and sat up, her bare feet meeting the wooden floor with a faint thump. She rubbed her eyes slowly, stretching her arms overhead until her fingers brushed the cool air. In the corner, her notebook rested patiently on the nightstand, still waiting for the page she'd left blank last night. She decided she'd write in it later, maybe after she took a little walk to see the neighborhood waking up. She padded to the window and drew the curtains back just enough to peek outside. Danville, in the early morning, was something special. The houses along her street looked peaceful, their windows reflecting the pale light. The sidewalks were still empty, and the air seemed to carry a quiet promise that the day would unfold gently. A few doors down, Mr. Jenkins was already outside watering the row of flowers along his fence. His straw hat tilted forward as he leaned over each bloom, and Isabella thought she could almost smell the faint sweetness of the blossoms from here. The neighborhood had its own unique soundtrack. Distant lawn sprinklers clicking on, the soft buzz of a delivery truck rolling slowly down the main road, the occasional bark from a dog greeting the day. It wasn't busy, but it was alive in its own unhurried way. Isabella dressed in light, comfortable clothes and slipped on her favorite sneakers. Pinky was quick to notice, hopping down from the bed with a small thud and looking up at her expectantly. "All right," she whispered, smiling. "Let's go see the world." They stepped outside into the cool embrace of the morning. The air carried the scent of dew and freshly cut grass, mingled with the faint aroma of someone's breakfast, drifting from a nearby open window. The street felt familiar, yet new, like a story she'd read many times, but always found fresh details in. The old maple tree near the corner rustled softly in the breeze, its branches swaying like it was greeting her. She walked toward it slowly, Pinky trotting a few steps ahead before stopping to sniff a patch of grass. Across the street, Mrs. Lopez was placing a small crate of apples on her porch table. Isabella waved politely, and Mrs. Lopez smiled warmly in return. "Fresh from the tree?" she called out softly. Isabella made a mental note to stop by on her way back. The sidewalks had a faint shimmer from the early dew, and each step made the soles of her shoes feel cool. She passed the park entrance and glanced inside. It was empty at this hour, save for a lone bench under the large oak tree, waiting for the day's visitors. She liked this part of Danville best when it was like this, before the laughter of kids filled the air, before the skateboards rattled along the pavement. Not because she disliked those things, but because she loved the rare moments of stillness in a place usually so full of energy. At the end of the block, a small breeze carried the faint chime of wind bells from a porch. The sound was delicate, almost like a secret whispered to the morning air. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the melody mingle with the rustling of leaves, the distant bird calls, and the hum of the waking neighborhood. Pinky tugged gently at the leash, bringing her back to the moment. She opened her eyes and smiled. There was more of the neighborhood to see, and the day was only just beginning. The path curved gently toward the quieter side streets, where the houses were spaced a little farther apart, and each front yard seemed to tell its own story. Some were neatly trimmed, every blade of grass in perfect order, while others had a wild charm. Flower beds bursting with mismatched blooms, vines curling up trellises in their own carefree designs. Isabella found herself slowing down here, drawn to the little details she didn't always notice on busier days. A row of tiny white flowers sprouting along the edge of someone's walkway. A ceramic frog statue peeking out from under a bush. A mailbox painted a bright, cheerful yellow with hand-painted daisies on its sides. Pinky stopped often, nose twitching as he investigated patches of ground with great interest. His little paws made soft tapping sounds against the concrete, blending into the gentle rhythm of their walk. A few houses down, an old radio played faint music from an open kitchen window, something soft and jazzy that seemed to belong perfectly to the stillness of the hour. Isabella tilted her head, letting the tune accompany the scene like a soundtrack meant just for her. At the corner, she spotted Mr. Hargrove sweeping his front porch. He wore his usual suspenders and a friendly, lived-in smile. "Morning, Isabella," he called out, his voice warm but unhurried. "Morning, Mr. Hargrove," she replied, giving a small wave. Pinky gave a quiet bark of greeting, his tail wagging. "You're up early," Mr. Hargrove remarked, leaning his broom against the railing. "Couldn't waste such a nice morning," Isabella said, and she meant it. The air was cool and crisp in a way that made it feel alive, the kind of morning you wanted to walk through slowly so you didn't miss a thing. Continuing along the sidewalk, she passed the small community garden. The gate was open, as it often was during the day, and inside, rows of plants stood neatly in their plots. Some were vegetables, their green leaves sturdy and strong, while others were flowers swaying gently in the breeze. A single butterfly drifted lazily between blooms, its wings catching the pale light in flashes of soft orange and cream. Isabella lingered for a moment, watching it move from one flower to the next, before it floated higher, disappearing over the garden fence. Pinky seemed to sense her pause and sat beside her patiently, his eyes following the butterfly's path. She reached down to give his head a gentle pat. "Come on," she murmured. "Let's see what else the neighborhood has for us today." Further down, the sidewalk narrowed slightly, shaded by a line of tall trees whose branches stretched toward each other across the street. The morning light filtered through the leaves, scattering in shifting patterns on the ground. Isabella slowed her steps to match the dappled rhythm of sunlight and shadow. From one of the shaded porches came the faint sound of a wind-up bird toy chirping, followed by the laughter of a child still hidden from view. It was the kind of sound that made the neighborhood feel like a living, breathing place, full of little moments happening quietly in the background. Near the end of the block, a small bakery stood tucked between two older brick buildings. Its windows were fogged slightly from the warmth inside, and the air outside carried the faint scent of fresh bread and pastries. Isabella hesitated in front of the door, tempted to step inside, but decided she'd save that for her walk back. She liked having something to look forward to. Pinky sniffed the bottom of the bakery's flower pots, clearly interested in whatever scents lingered there. Isabella smiled and tugged the leash gently, guiding him onward. As they turned the next corner, the street grew even quieter. Fewer cars passed here, and the houses had deeper yards with tall hedges or wooden fences lining them. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the soft clink of a spoon stirring in a mug, carried through an open kitchen door. It was a neighborhood in no rush, the kind where mornings could stretch gently toward noon without anyone minding. Isabella breathed it all in, the smell of baking bread lingering behind them, the rustle of trees ahead, and the reassuring sound of Pinky's little paws keeping pace with her own. The street sloped gently downward, guiding them toward a small park tucked between two rows of houses. Isabella had been here countless times, but in the quiet of the morning, it felt almost like a secret place. The park's entrance was marked by a low wooden arch wrapped in climbing ivy. Dew clung to the leaves, tiny droplets sparkling in the muted light. As she stepped under the arch, Isabella felt the cool, earthy scent of damp soil and fresh grass wrap around her. Pinky's ears perked up immediately, and he trotted forward eagerly, nose low to the ground. Isabella followed at a leisurely pace, letting the leash extend so he could explore. The gravel path wound in a slow curve through the park, passing benches that still glistened faintly from the night's moisture. A robin perched on the backrest of one bench, head tilted as it listened for movement in the grass below. To the right, a narrow creek trickled softly over smooth stones, its surface catching the pale glints of morning light. Isabella slowed beside it, leaning over the low wooden railing to watch the water. Fallen leaves drifted lazily along the current, turning in slow circles before continuing downstream. The sound of the creek blended with the occasional rustle of leaves overhead. It was the sort of soft, layered quiet that made you feel you could hear your own thoughts more clearly. As they walked further, Isabella noticed the familiar sandbox ahead. It was empty now, though the faint outlines of tiny footprints from the day before were still pressed into the sand. Nearby, the swing swayed ever so slightly, moved by a breeze too gentle to feel. Pinky sniffed along the edge of the play area, finding some scent trail only he could understand. She watched him for a moment before her gaze lifted toward the horizon. Beyond the park, she could see the tops of the Danville rooftops in uneven lines, chimneys and antennas, standing quietly against the pale sky. They circled around the park slowly, passing the picnic tables under a grove of birch trees. Someone had left a folded newspaper on one of the benches, a headline half visible under its curled edges. Isabella didn't stop to read. It didn't feel like a moment for news. Instead, she led Pinky toward the far exit of the park, where the gravel path turned back into sidewalk. Here the air smelled faintly of lavender from a garden nearby, and Isabella found herself breathing more deeply, as though wanting to take some of the scent with her. On this quieter stretch of road, she passed only a single jogger, their footsteps steady and rhythmic. They exchanged polite nods before continuing on their opposite paths. Pinky, apparently satisfied with his park exploration, walked now with a more even pace, occasionally glancing up at her as though to check that she was enjoying the morning as much as he was. The houses here were older, their paint faded in places, but their porches well kept, Wind chimes tinkled softly from a few doorways, their sounds mingling with the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere far off. Isabella slowed near a familiar blue house with wide white shutters. She remembered coming here for a neighborhood bake sale last summer, tables spread with pies and muffins under the shade of the big oak tree in the yard. She could almost still hear the laughter and the sound of paper plates crinkling as people filled them with desserts. But this morning the yard was still. The only movement came from the shadows shifting gently under the oak's branches. A few more steps brought them to another corner, where a small bird bath stood at the edge of a garden. 2 sparrows were splashing energetically, sending little droplets into the air. Pinky perked up but didn't pull toward them. He seemed content just to watch. Isabella smiled at the sight, thinking how even the tiniest parts of the morning felt alive here. By the time they reached the next block, the sound of the creek had faded behind them, replaced by the distant clink of dishes being set out for breakfast. A soft golden light had begun to settle over the street, making the houses look warmer, their windows glowing faintly. It was the kind of neighborhood that felt like it held its breath in the early hours, saving its noise for later in the day. And Isabella, walking with Pinky at her side, was more than happy to be part of its quiet for just a little longer. They turned down Maplewood Lane, one of Isabella's favorite streets in all of Danville. The houses here were set a little farther back from the road, each with a front yard framed by low hedges or picket fences. The morning light filtered through the tall maple trees lining the street, scattering dappled patterns across the pavement. Pinky slowed to sniff near the base of one tree where tiny wildflowers had sprouted in a cluster. Isabella crouched beside him, gently brushing her fingers against one of the blooms. Its petals were soft, almost translucent in the light. She didn't pick it, just admired how something so small could brighten a patch of soil by simply being there. A light breeze rustled the leaves above them, carrying with it the faint scent of fresh bread. Isabella glanced up, following the smell toward a small corner bakery at the end of the lane. She could just make out the silhouette of the baker through the window, moving between racks of steaming loaves. They continued walking, and as they neared the bakery, Isabella paused to watch the scene through the glass. Shelves lined with golden brown bread and rows of delicate pastries were being arranged behind the counter. The air outside already hinted at the warmth inside, and for a moment she wished she could step in, just to wrap herself in the scent. But Pinky tugged gently on the leash, his attention drawn to a fluttering movement near a lamppost. A small paper flyer was pinned there, its corners curling from the morning's dampness. It was for the upcoming Danville Spring Festival, colorful, with hand-drawn flowers along the border. Isabella smiled faintly, remembering last year's festival, with its stalls, music, and laughter. Moving on, they passed a row of gardens, each with its own character. One was neat and symmetrical, with evenly spaced rose bushes in full bloom. Another was a wild tangle of daisies and sunflowers, buzzing gently with the sound of bees at work. Pinky seemed to enjoy the wilder garden, pausing to watch a butterfly hover over a patch of clover. His head tilted slightly, ears perked, as the butterfly danced just out of reach. Isabella chuckled softly. "Don't even think about it," she murmured. Though she knew he wouldn't chase, it was enough for him to simply look. The road curved, and ahead lay the small footbridge that crossed over a narrow canal. Water trickled lazily beneath it, reflecting patches of blue sky between drifting clouds. Isabella stepped onto the bridge, leaning over the railing. The water's surface shimmered faintly, carrying with it fallen petals from somewhere upstream. She lingered there for a while, resting her chin on her hand and letting her eyes trace the gentle flow. There was no rush. The rest of Danville might still be waking, but here on the bridge the world felt suspended, as if time had slowed just for her and Pinky. Eventually, they moved on, taking the final stretch toward home. Familiar houses came into view, their front doors opening here and there as neighbors stepped out to retrieve the morning paper or waved to someone across the street. The smell of brewed coffee drifted from an open window, mingling with the sharper scent of freshly watered lawns. Pinky trotted ahead now, clearly recognizing the way back. His tail swayed in an easy rhythm, and Isabella followed, her steps matching his pace. By the time they reached her own street, the light had deepened into that rich, honeyed gold that comes just after sunrise. The shadows were longer, stretching across the sidewalks, and the coolness of early morning was slowly giving way to a softer warmth. Her house stood just ahead, its windows catching the light. Isabella's heart swelled a little at the sight, not because it was grand, but because it was hers. Every creak in the floor, every corner in the yard, every scratch on the fence was part of her world. As they stepped through the gate, the latch clicking softly behind them, Isabella breathed in the quiet again. The neighborhood was coming alive now, but the peace of the walk lingered like a gentle echo in her mind. Pinky gave a happy shake, his fur fluffing out, before trotting toward the porch steps. They climbed them together, side by side, the soft thud of their steps blending into the stillness that seemed to hold the morning in place. The gentle hum of the neighborhood still lingered in Isabella's ears as she set Pinky's leash on the hook by the door. The morning walk had been soothing, but now a quiet spark of nostalgia began to stir inside her. She crossed the living room toward a tall, narrow cabinet tucked beside the bookshelf. It was painted in soft lilac tones, its surface slightly worn from years of use. Isabella hesitated for just a second before opening the small brass latch. The door creaked softly, revealing rows of neatly stacked boxes, envelopes, and scrapbooks, her personal treasure trove of memories. The top shelf held what she was looking for, a small wooden box with Fireside Girls burned into the lid in careful looping script. Lifting it down, she placed it on the coffee table. The lid opened easily, and the faint scent of cedar rose from inside. One by one, she began taking out the contents: colorful merit badges, folded sashes, a few camp brochures, and bundles of photographs tied with ribbon. The top photograph she picked up was sun-faded but still full of life. In it, she and her fellow Fireside Girls stood in a circle, wearing their crisp uniforms and beaming at the camera. Behind them, a summer camp banner fluttered lazily in the breeze. She traced a fingertip over the image, remembering exactly how the grass had felt under her shoes that day, and how the air had smelled faintly of toasted marshmallows from the campfire. Another photo showed a day at the park, where they had planted a small garden as part of a community project. Isabella smiled at the memory of digging in the soil alongside her friends, their hands covered in dirt, but their hearts warm with purpose. She reached for a faded blue merit sash, running her hand over the small embroidered symbols. Each one told a story, helping at the animal shelter, organizing a neighborhood cleanup, baking for the community fair. These weren't just patches. They were moments captured in thread, each earned through laughter, teamwork, and sometimes a little trial and error. Setting the sash aside, Isabella found a folded paper tucked at the bottom of the box. She carefully opened it, revealing a letter written in looping handwriting. It was from the troop leader, Miss Maple, thanking her for unwavering kindness and leadership during the summer of the Great Lemonade Stand fundraiser. Isabella chuckled softly. She remembered that fundraiser vividly. They'd intended to raise money for a new campfire ring, but a sudden rainstorm had turned the whole event into a messy, giggling adventure under umbrellas. The more she looked through the box, the more the memories layered over each other like soft pages in a well-loved book. She could almost hear the distant voices of her friends, Gretchen's calm advice, Holly's bursts of enthusiasm, Millie's gentle giggle. The troop meetings had been more than just gathering. They were a little family, built around shared goals and quiet support. Pinky, who had been napping on the rug, lifted his head and wandered over. He sniffed at the box, his nose brushing against a tiny brass whistle tucked in one corner. Isabella picked it up, twirling it in her fingers. This, she told him softly, was how Miss Maple called us together when it was time for a meeting. One short blow, and everyone knew it was time to focus. She lifted it to her lips and gave the faintest puff. The sound was sharp but delicate, and for a moment Isabella almost expected to hear footsteps rushing toward her from somewhere down the street. Of course, the house remained quiet, save for the soft ticking of the wall clock. Leaning back against the couch cushions, she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the swirl of images and sounds wash over her. There had been long hikes under the summer sun, rainy afternoons spent crafting badges indoors, and winter nights gathered around a campfire, singing songs that drifted up into the star-speckled sky. When she opened her eyes, she carefully set the whistle back in its place. The box, with all its contents, wasn't just a collection of things. It was a map to the person she'd become, each memory shaping her in ways she hadn't always noticed. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, her fingers drifting from one object to another, but time seemed to slow, wrapping her in the warm glow of the past. The afternoon sunlight slanted in through the window, casting a warm golden hue across the living room floor. Isabella shifted slightly so she could stretch her legs, the wooden box still open before her like a portal to another time. She picked up one of the scrapbooks, a thick, spiral-bound album with a soft fabric cover in pale green. A small hand-sewn patch of the Fireside Girls emblem was stitched into the corner. As she opened it, the first page greeted her with bright, glittery letters. Troop 463, Adventures Achievements. Each page was filled with photographs, pressed flowers, ticket stubs, and the occasional smudge of dirt or paint. The imperfections made it all the more real, proof that these weren't just staged moments but snapshots from their actual lives. One section of the scrapbook made her laugh out loud. It was from the infamous Lost Compass camping trip. The photos told the whole chaotic tale, smiling group shots at the trailhead, increasingly puzzled expressions as the day wore on, and finally a triumphant picture of the troop around a hastily built camp in a clearing they'd found purely by accident. There was even a pressed leaf taped to the page with the note, "From the tree that gave us shade while we tried to figure out which way was north." Her laughter softened as she turned the page and saw a series of photographs from their community winter blanket drive. There was Holly, mid-laugh, holding up a blanket that had been knitted far too large for a single bed, Gretchen balancing 3 bags of donated clothes at once, and Isabella herself wrapping a colorful scarf around an elderly woman's shoulders. She remembered how cold it had been that day, but also how warm the smiles were. Halfway through the scrapbook, she found a small, transparent envelope taped to the page. Inside was a badge she hadn't thought about in years, the Unexpected Kindness Award. It was shaped like a small, golden sun, and she recalled receiving it after stopping to help a younger troop member who had twisted her ankle during a parade. It had been a small thing, at least in Isabella's mind, but Miss Maple had told her that kindness, especially when unplanned, deserved to be celebrated. Pinky hopped up onto the couch beside her, resting his chin on her leg. She smiled and stroked his fur absently as she turned to the next set of pages. Here the photographs were different, more candid, more personal. There were silly selfies before the troop meetings began. snapshots of half-finished crafts, and group pictures where not everyone was looking at the camera. These were the moments that reminded her how much life had been in those years, how every meeting had its own little rhythm of joy and chaos. She paused at a page dedicated to their end-of-year traditions. Each year, they'd gather around a bonfire, roasting marshmallows while sharing their favorite moments from the past months. She remembered the crackle of the fire, the glow on everyone's faces, and the sound of laughter mixing with the faint hum of cicadas. It was always bittersweet, celebrating what they'd done while knowing another year had come to a close. On one page, tucked behind a photograph, she found a folded paper that made her heart tighten slightly. It was a note from Millie, written years ago. "Izzy, thanks for always listening. I know I don't say much, but I feel better whenever I'm around you. You make everyone feel safe. I hope we're friends forever." The ink had faded just a little, but the words felt as fresh as the day she first read them. Isabella held the note for a long time, her thumb tracing the loops of Millie's handwriting. Outside, a soft breeze rustled the leaves, and the light in the room shifted just enough to catch the edges of the scrapbook pages, making them shimmer faintly. Isabella took a slow breath, realizing how much these memories had anchored her, even without her noticing. The lessons of teamwork, patience, and kindness weren't just tied to the troop. They had become part of her daily life. She reached for the next scrapbook in the pile, this one with a bold orange cover and tiny doodles along the margins, ready to sink further into the chapters of her Fireside Girls story. The orange scrapbook's cover was slightly worn along the edges, as if it had been carried on more than one adventure. Isabella traced one of the little doodles in the corner, a stick-figured troop member holding a flag, and opened it carefully. This scrapbook was less polished than the last, almost like it had been made in the middle of a whirlwind summer. The pages were colorful, but the photos weren't perfectly aligned, and some captions trailed off mid-sentence as if someone had been pulled away mid-writing. It felt alive in a different way, full of energy and spontaneity. The first spread was from Operation Butterfly Rescue. She smiled at the memory, how Gretchen had spotted a small, overgrown patch of flowers near the park, swarming with monarch butterflies. The troop had spent the afternoon carefully trimming away weeds and adding fresh nectar plants to help the butterflies thrive. The photos showed them working in gloves, sun hats tilted at silly angles, and Pinky watching from the sidelines, like an honorary member of the troop. Isabella laughed softly at one photo where Addison was trying to take a serious group picture, only for Katie to photobomb by holding two dandelions like antennae above her head. She could almost hear the giggles that followed. Turning the page, she found the Fireside Fair bake-off section. The smell of cinnamon rolls and sugar cookies seemed to drift back to her as she saw the images. Rows of colorful pastries lined up on long tables, pink frosting smeared across aprons, and the proud moment when their troop's pie won first place for most creative decoration. The winning pie had been shaped like their troop badge, complete with tiny dough braids for detail. She lingered over a series of Polaroids from an overnight camp. The firelight had lit their faces in warm orange, and someone, probably Gretchen, had drawn silly mustaches on the Polaroid frames afterward. In the corner of one photo, a small lantern cast a gentle glow on Isabella's younger self, caught mid-laugh as Holly told a dramatic ghost story. Tucked inside a pocket in the back cover was a folded map of Danville's outskirts. On the map, little star stickers marked various troop activities, community gardens, cleanup sites, camp locations, and one star way out by the river labeled Only Secret Spot. Isabella smiled knowingly. That spot had been their quiet getaway place, a shaded bend in the river where they could talk without distractions, skipping stones and watching dragonflies skim across the water. She set the orange scrapbook aside and reached for a much smaller one at the bottom of the box. It was more of a journal than a scrapbook, with lined pages and the occasional taped-in photo. The first page held Miss Maple's neat handwriting. For Troop 463's official scribe, Isabella Garcia Shapiro. Isabella remembered when she'd been chosen for that role. She'd thought it was just about writing meeting notes, but it had become so much more. She wrote about troop challenges, how they solved them, and even small moments of kindness between members. Her younger self had carefully documented everything, from the time they accidentally adopted a stray kitten for an afternoon, to the day they delivered their 100th handmade scarf to the local shelter. As she flipped through, she found a particular entry that made her stop. It was about the summer day they'd built birdhouses in Phineas's backyard. She had written in bubbly handwriting, "Phineas made it look easy, but I put mine together upside down. It still works, though. Somehow the birds love it." She chuckled quietly, remembering that upside-down birdhouse still hanging in a nearby tree for years afterward. The sound of Pinky shifting on the couch drew her back to the present. He nudged his head into her side, and she gave him a gentle scratch between the ears before closing the journal and stacking it on top of the other scrapbooks. The box wasn't empty yet, though. At the very bottom, she saw a bundle wrapped in a faded blue scarf. Her fingers paused before unwrapping it, as if her hands instinctively knew it contained something extra special. Isabella gently lifted the bundle from the box, the faded blue scarf slipping softly against her fingers. The fabric was worn but well cared for, its threads faintly smelling of campfire smoke and lavender soap, a mix that instantly pulled her into old memories. She laid it across her lap and carefully unwrapped it, each fold revealing a glimpse of something inside. At last, the scarf opened to reveal a small collection of items, a time capsule of sorts. Right on top was her first Fireside Girls sash. The fabric was a lighter shade of pink than she remembered, its edges slightly frayed, but every badge was still firmly in place. She ran her fingertips over them one by one, recalling each small triumph. There was the Community Helper badge, earned after organizing a book drive, the Wilderness Explorer badge from the time they camped under the meteor shower, the Creative Arts badge that had taken her 3 days of painting to complete. Each little circle of cloth was more than just thread and fabric. It was a story, a moment frozen in time. Beneath the sash was a small silver whistle. She remembered it well. It had belonged to Miss Maple, their troop leader, who had passed it on to Isabella when she temporarily led a meeting in her absence. Isabella had been so nervous at first, but the whistle had felt like a symbol of trust. She turned it over in her palm, feeling the slight indentation where Miss Maple's name had once been engraved before years of handling had worn it smooth. Next came a stack of tiny folded notes, bound together with a thin pink ribbon. Isabella hesitated before untying it. These were troop letters, passed between members during campouts or in the back row of meetings. She unfolded the top one and smiled instantly. "Thanks for making the marshmallows last night. Best s'mores ever." Signed simply, K. Another note read, "If you're ever sad, meet me at the secret spot." She could almost hear the voices of her friends as she read them, each note carrying the tone of the person who'd written it. Near the bottom of the bundle was something she hadn't expected, an old Polaroid of her and Phineas. They were both much younger, standing in the backyard with a half-built project behind them. She was wearing her Fireside Girls sash and holding a hammer, and he had a goofy smile plastered across his face, holding up a wooden plank like it was a trophy. Across the bottom, someone had scribbled in marker, "Best team ever." Her chest warmed at the memory. That had been the day they'd built the birdhouses for the neighborhood, the same ones mentioned in her journal earlier. She hadn't realized someone had captured it in a photo. At the very bottom of the scarf bundle was a small key, tiny, brass, and a little tarnished. Isabella turned it over in her palm, puzzled at first, until recognition flickered in her eyes. It was the key to the old troop supply chest, the one they kept in the meeting hall. She remembered being given the key for safekeeping during a particularly busy summer. She'd forgotten to return it, and somehow, all these years later, it had found its way into her keepsakes. She wrapped the items back in the scarf, pausing for a moment to hold it close. The weight in her hands felt heavier now, not in a burdensome way, but with the comfort of knowing these memories were hers to keep. Carefully, she placed the bundle back into the box, setting it atop the other scrapbooks and journals. The living room was quiet again, save for the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen and Pinky's gentle breathing beside her. Isabella leaned back against the couch cushions, closing her eyes for a moment. She let herself drift in the warmth of the memories she'd just unearthed, the colors and laughter of the past still vivid in her mind. Outside, the night deepened over Danville, but inside, Isabella sat in the soft glow of the lamp, the box of Fireside Girls memories beside her, an entire chapter of her life tucked neatly into one safe place. The moon was high over Danville, casting a pale silver glow across the rooftops when Isabella stepped out into her backyard. She'd been restless all evening, the memories from the Fireside Girls box still buzzing in her mind like a song she couldn't quite stop humming. Instead of curling up in bed, she had found herself wandering to the sliding glass door, barefoot, with a sweater draped around her shoulders. The cool night air greeted her instantly, brushing against her cheeks and making the fabric sleeves feel warmer by contrast. Her backyard wasn't large, but it held something that had always been special to her. A small patch of garden she had started years ago, back when the Fireside Girls had done a grow-your-own badge project. The Dream Garden, she had called it back then. In daylight, it was a modest cluster of flowers, vines, and a few herbs, but at night, under the moonlight, it felt like something out of a storybook. Tiny white blossoms caught the silver light, almost glowing against the shadows. The mint leaves released a faint scent whenever the breeze stirred them, mixing with the faintly earthy smell of the soil. Even the old wooden trellis, which had once seemed far too large for the climbing plants she'd trained against it, now stood draped in lush green leaves that swayed like slow-moving waves. Isabella stepped onto the grass, the dew cool against her toes. She crouched beside a row of lavender she had planted the summer after her first big Fireside Girls camping trip. The buds were closed for the night, but she could still smell their calming fragrance. She brushed a hand gently along the stems, careful not to disturb them. The dream garden had been more than just plants. It had been a project born out of her wish to create a space where people could come, sit, and feel at peace. When she first planted it, she'd imagined her friends coming over after school, sitting in the shade of the trellis with iced tea and laughter. And while that had happened a few times, the garden had mostly been her own quiet retreat. Tonight, though, she felt the garden pulling her back into its story. She crossed to the far side where a weathered bench sat under the branches of a small cherry blossom tree. It was one of the few things she hadn't changed over the years. The bench had belonged to her grandmother, and though the paint was chipped in places, it was still as sturdy as the day she had carried it here. She sat down slowly, her hands folding in her lap as she looked out over the flowers. The night had a stillness to it, broken only by the soft chirping of crickets somewhere near the fence. Overhead, the stars glimmered faintly, scattered like drops of light across a dark canvas. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds and scents of the garden wash over her. It reminded her of the way she used to dream here when she was younger. She'd sit in this very spot, imagining what adventures tomorrow might bring. Whether it was a Fireside Girls mission, a new idea from Phineas, or a neighborhood mystery to solve. Opening her eyes again, Isabella noticed something she hadn't paid attention to in years. A small, half-buried stone near the base of the cherry blossom tree. She leaned forward, brushing away the soil with her fingers until she revealed the carved letters, Wishsta. She had put it there the very first day she'd planted the garden, thinking it would be fun to have a place where visitors could make a wish. Smiling faintly, she picked it up. The surface was smooth and cool, with just enough wear to make the engraving seem softer. She couldn't remember the last time she'd made a wish on it, but somehow holding it now felt important. She looked out at the moonlit blossoms and whispered softly, "I wish." But the rest of the words stayed in her heart, unspoken, because some wishes were meant to be kept between you and the night. The stone sat in her palm for another moment, before she set it carefully back in its spot. A breeze swept through the garden, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves and a sudden feeling that the garden itself was listening. The breeze lingered for a moment, carrying with it the scent of mint and lavender, before fading into the stillness again. Isabella leaned back against the bench, her sweater pulled tighter around her shoulders. The garden seemed more alive tonight than usual, not in the literal sense, but in that quiet, watchful way where every petal, leaf, and branch felt like it had its own small story to tell. Her eyes wandered toward the old wooden birdhouse hanging near the fence. It had been part of the Fireside Girls Animal Habitats project years ago, and though the paint had faded from bright yellow to a soft, worn cream, it still stood proudly. She remembered the afternoon she and her friends had nailed it into place, laughing when Gretchen accidentally dropped a handful of nails into the flower bed. For weeks afterward, Isabella had kept watch to see if any birds would move in, and they had. Robins in spring, sparrows in summer. Now, under the pale glow of the moon, the birdhouse was quiet, but she imagined its tiny residents curled up safely inside, tucked away from the night air. The thought made her smile. There was something comforting about the idea that the garden wasn't just hers, it was shared. The birds, the bees, even the occasional squirrel that darted along the fence, they all had a place here. It was a little ecosystem, a corner of the world where life went on gently and without rush. Her gaze dropped to the patch of wildflowers in the corner. When she'd first planted them, she'd chosen colors she thought would be cheerful, pinks, yellows, and whites. Now, in the moonlight, they took on softer tones, almost muted pastels that seemed to blend into the shadows. She reached out to brush her fingertips over one of the petals, marveling at how cool and velvety it felt. For a moment, she closed her eyes again and let the garden fade into a memory. She saw herself years ago wearing her Fireside Girls sash, dirt smudged across her cheeks, proudly holding a watering can. She could almost hear the chatter of a troop, the rustle of paper badge checklists, and the clinking of tools as they worked. When she opened her eyes, she found herself staring at the far corner of the yard, at the small patch of soil she had once called the secret spot. It wasn't visible from the porch or the neighboring yards, hidden behind a low row of shrubs and a climbing vine. Back when she'd first built the garden, she had imagined it as a special place for her friends to come and tell their wishes or share secrets. But over the years, it had become her own private corner. She hadn't visited it in a while. Curious, she stood and made her way across the grass. The dew sparkled under her feet, catching faint threads of moonlight. She parted the shrubs gently, the leaves brushing against her arms as she stepped inside the small, secluded nook. It was smaller than she remembered, maybe because she had grown taller, but the feeling was the same, a sense of being tucked away from the rest of the world. In the center sat a small ceramic pot, the kind she used to hide tiny treasures in when she was younger. She crouched down, brushing away the thin layer of dirt that had collected on the lid, and lifted it carefully. Inside was a collection of small keepsakes, a faded ribbon from an old Fireside Girls uniform, a smooth pebble she had painted with pink swirls, and a tiny folded note. She picked up the note and unfolded it gently. In her younger handwriting, uneven and a little smudged, the message read, "For future Isabella, keep dreaming, even when it feels silly. You're the one who makes them real." Her breath caught for a second. She didn't even remember writing it, but the words landed with a strange kind of warmth. She smiled faintly, tucking the note back into the pot before closing the lid. Standing again, she let her gaze drift up toward the stars. The garden around her seemed to hum quietly, as if it had been waiting for her to remember all of this. And maybe, she thought, it had. The stars above Danville had that faint shimmer you only noticed if you stared long enough, as though the night sky was slowly exhaling. Isabella lingered in the secret spot, letting the silence stretch. Somewhere in the distance, a cricket chirped lazily, and the faint hum of traffic was softened by the thick hedges surrounding her yard. She wandered back out into the main garden, her footsteps muffled by the grass. The air was crisp enough to make her cheeks pink, but she didn't mind. It kept her awake, kept her present. Passing by the row of tomato plants, she crouched down to check on them, brushing a leaf aside to reveal a cluster of small, pale green tomatoes still ripening. She made a mental note to give them a little extra water tomorrow, though she knew the weather had been kind this week. As she stood, her eyes caught the corner of the garden where she'd planted jasmine vines years ago. Back then, she'd picked them because she'd heard they bloomed at night, their fragrance strongest after sunset. Sure enough, the flowers were glowing faintly in the moonlight, their soft perfume drifting through the cool air. She leaned closer, closing her eyes for a moment as she breathed in. It was a scent she could never quite put into words, sweet but not heavy, delicate yet persistent, the kind of fragrance that clung to memories. For Isabella, jasmine always meant summer nights at home. It meant evenings spent sketching designs for Fireside Girls uniforms or writing little notes to her friends. It meant walking barefoot in the garden, listening to the neighborhood wind down for the night. And it meant feeling completely safe, as though the world outside the fence could wait until morning. She brushed a stray strand of hair from her face and kept walking. Near the back fence, a wooden trellis supported an arch of climbing roses. The blooms had thinned since the peak of the season, but enough petals remained to catch the pale silver light, looking almost like frost. She reached out to touch one, careful of the thorns, and felt the cool softness between her fingers. From somewhere above, an owl hooted, low and deliberate. Isabella tilted her head, scanning the branches of the tall oak tree just outside her yard, but she couldn't spot it. Still, the sound felt like part of the garden, another nighttime voice joining the chorus. She found herself drawn toward the stone path winding through the center of the yard. Each stone had been placed by hand years ago, uneven but charming. She remembered how long it had taken to arrange them just right, and how her mother had watched from the porch with a smile, calling out encouragement. Now the stones were weathered and slightly mossy, but they still led the way like old friends. Halfway down the path, she stopped. Something about the way the light fell made the garden look different. The moonlight and shadows painted strange patterns on the ground, and for a second, she imagined she was standing somewhere else entirely. A place that wasn't her backyard, but a dream version of it. A garden that stretched endlessly, where the plants whispered and the flowers leaned in to listen. She shook her head with a small laugh. I've been spending too much time alone out here, she thought. But she didn't mean it in a bad way. The garden had always been a place where her imagination ran wild, and tonight it seemed especially eager to lead her somewhere. Her hand brushed against the leaves of the rosemary bush as she walked, releasing a fresh, sharp scent into the air. She picked a small sprig and rolled it between her fingers, breathing in its earthy perfume. It grounded her in the moment, even as her thoughts wandered. Finally, she reached the edge of the pond she'd helped her troop build one summer. It wasn't large, just a small circle of water lined with smooth stones. But the surface was perfectly still, reflecting the stars above. A couple of lily pads floated near the center, and she could just make out the faint outline of a goldfish drifting lazily beneath the surface. She crouched by the water's edge, resting her chin on her knees. The reflection of the sky looked so clear that she almost felt she could reach in and touch it. For a while, she just stayed there, watching the faint ripples whenever the fish moved. The quiet felt heavy, but not lonely. It was the kind of stillness that wrapped around her like a blanket. A faint breeze stirred the surface of the pond, sending the starry reflection rippling like it had been brushed by invisible fingers. Isabella's hair swayed with it, and she pulled her sweater tighter around herself. The air was getting cooler, the night slowly deepening into its quietest hour. Somewhere far off, a dog barked twice and then went silent again. She picked up a small pebble from the ground and rolled it in her palm before gently tossing it into the pond. The plop was soft but satisfying, and she watched as circles spread outward, distorting the stars. There was something about that moment, how a single action could ripple across an otherwise untouched surface, that felt both powerful and fragile at the same time. Her gaze drifted past the pond to the wooden bench under the mulberry tree. She hadn't sat there in weeks. It was a little weather-worn, its paint peeling in spots, but it had always been one of her favorite thinking spots. Tonight she decided it deserved her company. She crossed over, her shoes brushing against the grass, and settled onto the bench. From this vantage point, she could see almost the entire garden at once, the pond glinting faintly in the moonlight, the neat rows of herbs, the low clusters of marigolds, and the vines climbing patiently up their trellises. It looked both small and infinite, bounded by fences, but limitless in the stories it could hold. She leaned back, tilting her head so she could see the sky. The moon was bright but not full, a delicate crescent hanging among countless pinpricks of light. As she watched, a shooting star streaked silently across the darkness. She almost whispered a wish, but instead she let the moment speak for itself. Some wishes, she thought, didn't need words. They just needed to be felt. A soft rustling came from the far corner of the yard where the hedge was thickest. At first she thought it was just the wind, but then she spotted a pair of glowing eyes low to the ground. Her heart skipped before she recognized the familiar outline of a neighborhood cat. It stepped into the open, its tail curling high, and padded across the lawn like it owned the place. Isabella smiled as it approached, letting it rub its head against her ankle before curling up beside her on the bench. The quiet companionship felt perfect. She didn't need to fill it with talk or movement. The garden was speaking in its own language tonight. The leaves whispered. The pond reflected. The flowers breathed their scent into the air. And now, a soft, steady purr added itself to the chorus. Her thoughts began to wander to the Fireside Girls again. She remembered campouts under the stars, crafting birdhouses, planting community gardens that seemed small at first but grew into something lasting. She realized her own garden was a lot like those projects. It started as an idea, something tiny and manageable, but over time it had become part of the neighborhood's fabric. A place people noticed in passing, even if they didn't know who tended it. Leaning forward, Isabella brushed her fingers along the petals of a rose beside the bench. They were cool and velvety, their scent mixing faintly with the jasmine on the breeze. She thought about how flowers never asked for applause. They simply bloomed, quietly and persistently, season after season. The cat hopped down from the bench and wandered toward the pond, pausing to sniff at the grass. Isabella followed its movement with her eyes, letting the stillness soak deeper into her bones. The night had a weight to it now, not heavy in a troubling way, but like a soft quilt pressing over everything, reminding her that the world outside her fence could wait until tomorrow. She let out a slow breath, savoring the coolness of the air filling her lungs. Somewhere inside, she knew the garden wasn't just a place she had built. It was a mirror of herself. The rows of herbs were her careful plans. The climbing vines were her dreams reaching upward. The pond was her quiet heart, still and reflective. And the flowers were her moments of joy, opening gently but fully when the time was right. Her gaze lingered on the pond one last time, its ripples now barely visible in the low light. She didn't feel ready to leave, but she knew there would be other nights like this, nights when the garden would wait for her, just as patient as always. Standing slowly, she gave the cat a final scratch behind the ears before walking back toward the house. The grass whispered beneath her steps, and as she reached the porch, she glanced back. The garden stretched out in silver and shadow, perfectly still, like a painting that would remain unchanged until the next breeze decided to brush across it. The first hint of morning arrived, not with the sun, but with the faintest shift in the air. It was still cool, still wrapped in the soft shadows of night. But somewhere along the horizon, a pale gray had begun to replace the black. Isabella stirred beneath her blankets, not from any alarm clock, but from the quiet awareness that the night was giving way to a new day. She didn't open her eyes right away. Instead, she listened. The garden outside was still mostly asleep, but it had started its slow chorus. A single bird testing its voice, the faint hum of distant insects, the lightest rustle of leaves as if the plants themselves were stretching after a long rest. It was the sound of promise, of things waiting to begin. When she finally sat up, her room felt faintly cool, a reminder of the night that had just passed. The curtains glowed softly, the light outside still weak but gaining strength. She slipped from bed and padded toward the window, drawing the curtain aside. The garden was draped in a thin veil of mist, every surface carrying a film of dew that caught the first touches of dawn. The roses looked like they had been sprinkled with tiny glass beads. The pond was calm, its surface mirroring the fading moon. And the grass looked almost silver under the dim light, each blade tipped with a delicate shimmer. Isabella rested her chin on her hand, smiling faintly. She had always loved this in-between time, the liminal space between night and day. The world hadn't yet decided which it wanted to be, and in that hesitation, there was magic. A warm thought came to her then, to be in the garden for sunrise. She quickly slipped on her sweater from the night before, still faintly carrying the scent of jasmine and cool air, and stepped into her slippers. The wooden floor was cool under her feet as she crossed to the door. When she opened it, the air met her like a friendly embrace, a little damp, a little brisk. She breathed in deeply, and the smell was intoxicating. Fresh soil, wet grass, and a faint trace of honeysuckle drifting from somewhere down the street. The garden's gate creaked slightly as she pushed it open, but the sound felt fitting, like a gentle announcement to the plants that she had arrived. She walked slowly across the grass, each step pressing down the dew before it sprang back again. She stopped by the pond first. The water was clearer than it had been in the moonlight, showing hints of the smooth stones beneath. A small dragonfly zipped across its surface, catching the light in its gossamer wings before disappearing into the mist. Isabella crouched, dipping a fingertip into the water, feeling its coolness against her skin. From somewhere in the trees, a louder chorus of birds began to rise. One call was answered by another, and soon it was as if the whole neighborhood had decided to greet the morning together. The sound was bright and effortless, making her smile within. She stood and walked toward the marigolds, noting how the flowers seemed to lean just slightly toward where the sun would soon appear. It reminded her of the Fireside Girls' early hikes, how they'd all point in the same direction when following a trail, each step taking them towards something they couldn't quite see yet but knew was there. The horizon was now lined with gold, bleeding gently upward into the soft gray. She could feel the moment building, the same way one senses a wave before it crests. And then, almost shyly, the edge of the sun peaked above the rooftops. Light spilled into the garden in quiet bursts, first touching the highest leaves of the mulberry tree, then gliding down to the vines, the roses, and finally the pond, which erupted into a blaze of glitter. Isabella turned her face toward it, closing her eyes and letting the warmth seep in. It wasn't yet strong, but it carried the unmistakable promise of the day ahead. In that moment, she felt as if the garden was waking up with her, and the two of them, girl and garden, were partners in greeting the world anew. The sunlight moved slowly, spilling across the garden like honey poured from a jar. Isabella stood still for a long while, just letting herself be part of it. Each moment seemed to hold more color than the one before. The roses deepened into richer shades of crimson and pink. The grass grew more vibrantly green, and the marigolds seemed to ignite in gold. A gentle breeze wandered through, ruffling her hair and carrying with it the scent of damp earth and blossoms. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime clinked softly, adding a faint, silvery note to the morning symphony. She turned her head toward the sound, catching sight of the little chime hanging from the porch post, swaying lazily. She began to walk again, each step slow and deliberate, as if not to wake the world too suddenly. Near the fence, a patch of daisies had opened themselves to the day. She crouched beside them, running a hand gently along the stem, careful not to disturb the tiny drops of dew clinging to the petals. She thought of the Fireside Girls and their gardening badges, how they had once spent an entire weekend planting flowers along the neighborhood park's edge. It had been hard work, but they had ended the day in much the same way she was now, sitting quietly among the plants, letting the earth's calm seep into them. The sound of footsteps on the sidewalk made her glance toward the street. It was Mrs. Garcia walking her little terrier, Milo, as she did every morning. The older woman gave a cheerful wave, her voice carrying lightly across the fence. "Up early, Isabella." "Couldn't sleep in," Isabella replied with a smile. "It's too beautiful out here." Mrs. Garcia laughed knowingly. "It always is if you're up to see it." When they had passed, the quiet returned, only now it wasn't quite the same. It was alive with tiny movements. A bumblebee wobbled its way toward a nearby lavender bush, dipping clumsily from bloom to bloom. A butterfly, its wings patterned in pale yellow and black, fluttered overhead before settling on the fence post. Isabella moved closer, watching as its wings slowly opened and closed in the sunlight, like a breathing creature savoring the warmth. The pond drew her back again, its surface now a dazzling mirror of the sky. She noticed fish moving lazily beneath the surface, their bodies streaks of orange and white weaving among the shadows of the stones. She crouched low, her reflection joining theirs for a brief moment, before ripples broke it apart. Her thoughts wandered as she traced her fingers along a blade of grass, catching the way the sunlight refracted in the dewdrops. It reminded her of little prisms she used to hang in her window as a child, scattering rainbows across her room. There was something comforting in the way morning light could turn something so simple into something worth stopping for. The sky overhead was now a clear, bright blue, washed clean of the night's darkness. The mist was fading quickly, retreating into corners and shadows. Isabella found herself sitting cross-legged on the lawn without even realizing she'd lowered herself there, the earth still cool beneath her. She tilted her head back, closed her eyes, and listened, truly listened, to the sound of the world waking up. The hum of bees, the trill of birds, the soft sway of leaves, it all wove together into something that felt like a quiet celebration. Not loud or rushed, but content. The kind of celebration where everyone knew they belonged. She breathed deeply again, letting it fill her before opening her eyes to watch the sunlight finally reach the last shaded corners of her garden. A patch of soft clover caught Isabella's eye, growing in a thick green carpet near the back fence. She remembered when she and the other Fireside Girls had spent an afternoon hunting for four-leaf clovers there, sprawled out on their stomachs, with the sun warm on their backs. That day had ended with them finding exactly one, and she'd pressed it between the pages of her Fireside Girls handbook, where it still rested, a little faded but intact. She lowered herself onto the clover now, feeling its cool, springy texture beneath her hands. The tiny leaves swayed gently in the morning air, as if greeting her in their own small way. Above her, the branches of the old maple tree shifted slightly, scattering dappled light over the ground. It felt like she was sitting in a quiet, living mosaic. Her gaze drifted toward the garden bench where a folded blanket still sat from the night before. She rose and walked toward it, the sound of her steps muffled by the grass. As she picked it up, a faint trace of the evening lingered in the fabric, a whisper of cool night air and the faint scent of the flowers nearby. She laid it across the bench again, neatly, as if keeping it ready for another peaceful night. The neighborhood was slowly coming alive now. The distant hum of a lawnmower drifted over the fences, mingling with the bark of a dog 2 houses down. Somewhere farther away, a door closed, followed by the sound of a bicycle bell. The quiet morning was becoming gently layered with signs of life, each sound soft enough not to disturb the stillness, but enough to remind her she wasn't alone in the world. She walked over to the small vegetable patch at the side of the garden. The tomatoes were still green, but the basil had flourished overnight, its leaves rich and full. She brushed her fingers lightly across them, releasing a burst of fresh scent into the air. She imagined later adding a few leaves to her breakfast, or maybe saving them for a light lunch. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows that angled across the yard. Isabella paused at the sight of Pinky trotting out from the porch, his tiny legs moving with surprising speed for such a small dog. He gave a cheerful bark and bounded toward her, pausing only when he reached her feet. She scooped him up and held him against her chest, feeling his steady heartbeat and soft warmth. They walked together toward the pond where Pinky watched the fish with curious tilts of his head. Isabella laughed softly, lowering him so he could sniff at the water's edge. His little nose twitched, and for a moment the scene was perfectly still, girl, dog, pond, and sunlight, all in quiet balance. A cloud drifted across the sun, softening the light. Isabella looked up at the shifting sky, watching the pale, cottony shapes float past. The way the light changed with the clouds made everything seem like it was breathing, alive in its own rhythm. Her gaze lowered back to the garden where the flowers seemed even more vivid against the muted light. The air felt slightly cooler in the shadow, and she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear as the breeze carried with it the faint smell of baking bread from a nearby kitchen. She thought about how these small moments often passed unnoticed, hidden in the rush of busy days. But here in her garden, with the morning stretching lazily ahead of her, they felt like treasures, tiny, irreplaceable pieces of a bigger, calmer life. The cloud drifted on, and sunlight returned to warm her shoulders. She let out a slow breath, smiling faintly to herself, and gave Pinky a gentle pat. The garden seemed to glow now under the full warmth of the morning sun. Each flower opened just a little wider, each leaf shimmered more brightly. Isabella stood quietly at the edge of the path, letting her gaze sweep across every familiar detail, each corner of the space that had carried her from the quiet evening before to this bright, living morning. Pinky had settled into a sunny patch near the steps, his eyes half closed, nose twitching as if he were dreaming even while awake. Isabella smiled at him, feeling that same comfortable drowsiness she had felt so many times in this garden before. The world seemed to move at a pace she could match, each moment stretching enough to be savored. She walked to the far side of the yard where the fence met the old lilac bush. The blossoms were fading now, but the scent lingered, sweet, calming, almost like a memory you could breathe in. She brushed her fingertips along the petals, then turned slowly toward the porch. The house waited for her in its quiet way, doors open to let in the air, windows reflecting the gentle blue sky. As she stepped inside, the coolness of the interior wrapped around her. The floorboards creaked softly underfoot, and in the kitchen, a mug of warm tea sat waiting on the counter. She carried it to the small table by the window and sat down, cradling the mug between her hands. Outside, the garden swayed and shimmered, sunlight slipping through leaves in slow, shifting patterns. She took a sip, the warmth filling her from within, and leaned back in her chair. Every sound around her felt softer now. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the muffled rustle of the curtains in the breeze, the occasional faint bark of Pinky outside. They blended together into a single, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of her home. For a moment she thought about the days to come, about afternoons in the garden, evenings in the neighborhood, the gentle cycle of Danville life that always seemed to bring her back to these moments of calm. There would be new adventures, of course. Phineas and Ferb had a knack for making sure of that, but there would also be mornings like this, where the world felt small, safe, and wonderfully still. She took another sip of tea, letting her gaze wander out across the yard. The sunlight shifted again as a breeze stirred the branches, scattering a few tiny petals across the grass. She imagined they were carrying away the last bits of yesterday's dreams, making room for new ones to take root. The warmth in her chest deepened, not just from the tea, but from the quiet certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. Home with its soft corners and familiar light. Home where the days could begin in peace and end in laughter. Isabella closed her eyes for just a moment, breathing in the scent of tea and fresh air, listening to the simple life of her surroundings. And in that stillness, everything felt perfectly in place. And as the sunlight settled gently over Danville, Isabella let her eyes rest for just a moment longer, holding on to the warmth of the morning. In her heart, she knew there would always be more days, more dreams, and more quiet moments like this. With Pinky at her side, she felt ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. But for now, the world could stay still just a little while longer,